Hi everybody, I hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm incredibly excited because today I get to interview Tony Levin. Tony Levin is one of the world's leading bass players. He's known for his innovation and, of course, his musicality, rather than his show-off virtuosity. And he's worked extensively with British prog rock acts and artists like King Crimson, and of course Peter Gabriel, but also with Yes and Pink Floyd. Levin plays with weight and gravity, with melody and emotion. He's created so many memorable bass lines, often using space between notes to get great effect. He's used fretted and fretless bass guitars. He's played with fingers or pick. He's also played with his funk fingers, which of course are those drumsticks taped to the end of his fingers. This is a guy that pushes the boundaries of musicality of bass playing itself. He also plays the Chapman stick and the NS electric upright. Cello and synth bass are also in his repertoire. I don't know if there is a more creative bass player. He pushes the boundaries. He allows us to think what bass playing could be. And special thanks goes to my very good friend, Mr. Jack Douglas, who recorded Tony, of course, on Double Fantasy, the last album that John Lennon did before he died. So it was with great pleasure that I get to talk to Mr. Tony Levin. Well, I think between you and Leland, you're like the most, Leland's all hair and all beard, and you've looked like Tony Levin since I can remember.
We once took a very interesting picture. I was sitting on a chair, and he came up behind me and put his beard like this, so it looked like I had long gray hair, and he had long gray hair. It looked almost realistic, actually.
Wait, how did you meet Jack?
It goes so far back that I don't think I remember, and I doubt if he remembers. It was certainly before the 1980 sessions, the John Lennon, the Yoko Ono sessions. I don't know. I had known him a long time before that. Done sessions that he produced and engineered, and done, I think, even when he was an assistant engineer, going way back. Maybe you could ask him. Maybe he'll remember.
In the early 80s, in particular, synths were like coming to the fold in a big way. You took bass playing and just started twisting it. You know, everything you were doing was like every song had its own specific sound, different. It was almost like, I wonder, were you fighting against, I don't want to be replaced by a synth. I want to be just as interesting. Not only just as interesting, more interesting than what any synth can do.
That's an interesting question. I think, first of all, I don't often think about what I was thinking when I played something. And chances are I wasn't thinking. But I've realized through the years of being asked about various parts that I didn't do anything as tricky or wise as you just suggested. What I seem to have always done was just react to the piece of music that I'm hearing and try to sort out in my head what would work well with it. Not what I've been practicing or what my latest technique is or sound, but what would work for that piece. And that's in general what I did. So I didn't really try to be, could we call it progressive? I didn't try like, I'm going to do something that the bass doesn't do. In fact, I think of myself as a very traditional player who just wants to play the right bass part for that piece. However, I fell in with some progressive folks, players, notably Peter Gabriel, who really was and is always open to alternative ways to do things. So he encouraged me. He liked when I played. We both kind of came from listening to Motown, simple bass and rhythm parts. And he liked when I did that, but he would suggest vague or even specific other things, or he would say, well, what about this line? And kind of set me off in a direction. And by the way, other artists did the same, suggested things to me that sent me off in a little different direction. And I suppose after a few years of being around Peter Gabriel and Robert Fripp and Bill Bruford and working out music that worked for them, I suppose my brain, my musical brain, accepted as normal the little bit more unusual stuff that I was doing.
That's a very humble answer. I can imagine it's people are coming to you because of that, though, of that creativity. You know, a bit beyond the fact that obviously your musicality is fantastic. So if we go back, you started playing double bass at 10. I can't imagine what would attract a 10-year-old to be like, I want to be the double bass player in an orchestra.
Well, hey, thanks for doing your homework and reminding me of things about myself that I'd forgotten. Yeah, it was 10. And I asked my parents back when they were alive, when they were quite old, I said, did I ever say anything about why the bass? I had studied piano in my family. My older brother, by the way, Pete, is a pianist and had studied French horn when he was young. And it was a standard thing that kids got to take piano lessons, like it or not. And at about 10, maybe 11, 10 or 11, I asked to play the bass. So I asked them why, and they said, no, we asked you, and you just said, I like the bass. And as trite as that sounds, it's quite amazing that a lot of years later, like really a lot of years later, I still just kind of like the bass. I like playing the low notes, and I didn't set out to reinvent the bass. I didn't set out to be a lead player and do guitar lines on the bass. I didn't set out to do anything, but I liked playing the bass. And I happen to know the answer to that question because I happened to ask my parents, who remembered that I just liked it. And I wouldn't say it's profound, but it speaks to the simplicity of musically where I'm at. Like playing the bass, still like it, still trying to get it right, still enjoying doing it.
And the tuba, you played the tuba as well.
I did for in my youth equally, the two. And I think when I know when I got to music school, Eastman School of Music, pretty heavy classical situation in Rochester, New York. I said on entrance, I said to the entrance as I was auditioning and stuff, I said, I'd like to play tuba and bass. And they said, forget the tuba. You're playing bass. and I pretty much, I put aside the tuba. I took it out again in 1976, because that would have been in 65 that I'm talking about. And in 76, recording Peter Gabriel's first solo album, there was one piece that kind of had a odd rhythm section thing. And I said, well, maybe the tuba would be right with this. And I played it on that track. And then I subsequently played it live with Peter, which was a lot of fun because I got a big sousaphone, or then I had a tuba that was electric. So I played it a little after that. The sad fact is, once you have a mustache, you got to put the tuba aside. You just can't. The mouthpiece is bigger than your lips, and the air is escaping through the mustache. So as long as I have a mustache, I won't be going back to the tuba, like it or not.
Now, at Eastman, is that where you met Steve Gadd?
Indeed. How lucky was I? Yeah, I came in a serious classical player who played a little bit of jazz, and 4 years later, I had accomplished what I wanted to, classical. I had been in the Rochester Philharmonic, and I was kind of looking for something else to do. And there, in the middle, there was Steve, already a great jazz player. Not so much, neither of us was a rock player in those days. And he kind of mentored me to get my time together, because I was inexorably on the beat, in the middle of the beat, being a classical player. And we had a good time, and still do. We have a long musical relationship, and I'm very lucky to have really musically grown up with him.
There's so many questions I could ask from just
from
the classical side, because, you know, obviously I want to get to how you ended up working with so many British musicians. But before we get there, I wonder, you know, having that classical background and listening to like early Genesis and early Crimson stuff, there's a lot of classical influences, you know, in British prog rock, which must have been very advantageous to you, you know, having already come from that background.
The fact is, it didn't work that way. At least I don't think it did. A lot of our musical careers, not just me, but a lot of it's luck and just what happens, the roll of the dice and the calls you happen to take, the ones you can't take. The drummer who was on that session then calls you for something else that's completely different. So I haven't really traced my career when I left Rochester, but I came to New York, played in some rock bands, and fell into studio work, not because I wanted to do studio work, but to pay the bills. kind of liked it. I felt it was a craft, but it wasn't so much an art as I had set out to do. And then when I got the chance to play live more, to go on the road, first with Peter Gabriel, it's not the first tour I did, but first in a major way with Peter Gabriel, I jumped at that chance and continued in that. So I never said, "Oh, I'm going to meet somebody like Peter Gabriel and Robert Fripp will be on the session, and then I'll do Robert's solo album, and then I'll learn how to play like English guys." It just was coincidence and a lot of luck. And if I want to pick out a seminal point, it's when Bob Ezrin, a great producer, whom I had been working with on a lot of projects, rock projects, and he got the call to produce Peter Gabriel, and he thought, well, Tony Levin will be appropriate for that. I don't know why he thought that, and I'm glad he did. And that's that day in '76, July of '76, that I met Peter Gabriel. I also met Robert Fripp that day, who was playing guitar on those sessions, and I met Steve Hunter and Dick Wagner and other people on it. But I don't know how many years later, that was '76. So a lot of years later, I'm still making music with Robert and with Peter, and very lucky because of that, and very grateful to Bob. My point was that I just kind of fell into that. I did care about things and I wanted to do the best music around, but I fell into that opportunity, worked out for me. They liked my playing, so it worked out for everybody. And that's the way it went down with me, more than that I had a direction and a plan to do that.
I do feel like, though, with that, all of that study you did would have been very advantageous. I mean, many people would have had the opportunity, but I think that the hard work and preparation that you put in would have paid off.
Maybe in my experience, I was never watching and thinking, "Oh, I'm ready for that because of this, because I did this." But in my experience, learning anything and knowing more about things doesn't usually diminish your ability to do other things. I know when I first moved to New York, I had and did sessions where they put charts. The arranger had charts, and I had to learn not to read the music exactly, because I was at the classical part of my brain, where I had been raised to see, just play every note that it says, no matter what. If it's the wrong note and you can see it's the wrong note, you play it anyway, because you're a classical guy, and that's what you do. So I had to learn to, it seems obvious to most people, but I had to learn that, okay, this is what the arranger kind of wanted, but I'm a better bass player than he is, a bass arranger. So let me do okay, I can see he wants busy here and he wants simple there. And I had to learn how to not read. And in a similar way, I think the classical training has helped me sometimes, and sometimes I had to kind of break away from it. In my experience, what I take from classical genre is the players, the orchestral players that I knew. I'm sure all of them have a gigantic respect for the best of the best, for the quality of music, the overall quality of music, and that's pretty special. And jazz, when I played, I still play it a bit and visit the genre. Sometimes jazz players have great ears. They really, what we used to call big ears. That was a long time ago, but they hear what all the other guys are doing, and there's all this interplay that the audience maybe is not, a lot of the audience is not aware of, and it doesn't matter, but they're hearing a scene in the piece that whether the audience knows it or not, and the interplay. So I tried to take from jazz, or I appreciated it, and I tried to take that kind of listening ability into rock, where some rock players do listen like that, and others just play their part and don't care, and that's fine. But I try to take the something of the ethic of classical and of rock, of jazz, into rock in that sense.
Is there any particular players growing up, that really inspired you to play bass?
Sure. I wasn't thinking it at the time, but I've mentioned that my older brother Pete is 3 years older. So when we were kids, he was the one who could afford to buy records, and he was a French horn player at that time, and bought jazz albums. This is in the 50s, with a wonderful Julius Watkins, a wonderful jazz French horn player, one of the only ones, and a great one. And in that rhythm section on all these various albums Pete had was Oscar Pettiford, great bass player. And I didn't hear Oscar Pettiford and think, "Oh, I'm going to play like that," or what did he do here? I didn't think about it, but I inhaled that music, and many years later, I realized when I heard some of it that I knew all of those bass parts by heart. And I think now, if I think back, I don't play that kind of jazz. Actually, my brother and I formed a group 10 years ago to try and play that kind of jazz, cool jazz of the 50s. But aside from that, I don't play in that style. But I could say that I have tried to play rock in the musical way that I heard Oscar Pettiford playing jazz, which is to play the right notes and only the right notes and to place them exactly right. This is what I try to do. I don't always succeed, but I try to place them in the right way and be an underpinning. And when there's a chance to step out, when the music wants it to step out in front. And so I was influenced a great deal. I mentioned Oscar Pettiford, but he's not the only bass player, of course, that I heard. And I think now that bass players listen to music maybe a little different than other people. Anything that's on the radio or something, I notice, I'm aware, some part of me is aware of what the bass player is doing. Hopefully there is a bass player and not a machine. If it's a machine, you can tell, and I kind of don't pay attention. But if it's a bass player, could be that something cool happens, harmonically, or where he's putting the beats or she's putting the beats, and I might not be thinking about it, but I'm aware of it. And I have the feeling most bass players are aware of that. And maybe even something that doesn't work, and how is you being an engineer would be super aware of this. How audible is the bass compared to the bass drum, and are they in sync and all that stuff. So I think we kind of listen to bass players, all of them, and are learning all the time on some level, maybe not front of consciousness, learning about, hey, that'd be a good thing to do, or boy, that's a bad thing. I'm never going to find myself doing that. And then we apply it to our playing. So it's a nice way to relate to music, because you can still enjoy the overall music and not even be aware of that, or you can just kind of focus on the bass and learn from it and grow as a bass player.
Now, I had a question here which is quite involved. You've worked with, inarguably the greatest drummers in the world: Steve Gadd, Rick Marotta, Phil Collins, Bill Bruford, Terry Bozzio. I mean, the list is insane. When you're working with these guys, are you finding that your groove is your groove, or do you click into these guys? It's such a vague question, but it's because I really want to know how it is working with such incredible players which have such defined styles. I mean, it must be a challenge and very exciting.
Yeah, it is, all that stuff. You're right. And some of the slipping into their groove, boy, there are so many drummers and so many different, it's not simply that each really great drummer has his own pocket and his own groove. It's not that. And we're not just at a session, or it's usually at a session, not live, but yeah, usually first you're making the album and then later you'll tour. We're not just thinking about, oh, how can we lock in and what's the rhythm section doing? There's reacting to the music, and it varies a lot with different drummers. And I think my objective is certainly to be in sync with that drummer, but not necessarily to line up exactly with them. Some albums and some styles of music, yes, I want to be right there, whether it's laying back behind the beat or on top of the beat or right on it. But others, not at all. In fact, some flammy looseness is utterly appropriate in some situations. And some of these drummers you mentioned very much want me to be synced in with them, and some don't, or it could be different at different times. So it's a variety. It's a very interesting question. And as you've mentioned, a variety of great drummers, there's a variety of approaches going on at the same time. And maybe even at the front of my brain, I'm not thinking about that at the time that we're doing the music. It depends, frankly, how hard it is. I just, an hour ago, re-listened to some tracks I did on with Bill Bruford. We formed a group called Bruford Levin Upper Extremities, and I hadn't listened to that in ages. And I'm just preparing the files to put up on YouTube, and I had to listen to a little bit of it, and it's extraordinary. And Bill didn't care at all about me syncing with him. In fact, the one piece that I gravitated to, I just played eighth notes with the funk fingers on the bass, but I played eighth notes in 4/4, and I wrote a different chord for each bar. In other words, the simplest, most boring bass part. Good, but just utterly simple. And I did that because I knew Bill I didn't know what he'd do, but I knew he's incredibly creative, and he's not going to do anything that I could imagine. And he changes time signature every bar. It just goes on this adventure, and the bass is wonderfully just there, like a click track, almost just doing this 4/4 thing that's irrelevant once you start listening to the drums. And he actually had a chart. He might have needed a calculator to do his chart, how many bars and where it's going to come out, and it was brilliant. But it was a hoot to listen to. But that's an example for you that comes to my mind, especially because it was only an hour ago that I heard it. Of how I wouldn't do that approach at all with another drummer. I would say, okay, let's play something together, and then let the other guys come up with something on top of that.
Then what about with Crimson? Because you've got 3 different drummers.
The current Crimson,
Stiletto, Gavin Harrison, and Jeremy Stacey. So
yes.
Is there a different approach? I mean, my guess is that you're a band. So when you do your interpretation of the song with those members, there's not like a click track and everything's designed to be exactly the same each night. I mean, you're all incredible creatives at the top of your game. But how do you think or do you not think, I think, is what I'm getting a sense of?
There's a lot to it. First of all, the guiding ethic, the guiding light of that band is Robert Fripp's ideas. And when Robert mentioned to me, the same as in the 90s when he said, 2 drummers, let's have 2 drummers. And I thought, this is going to be hard for me. So when he said 3 drummers, what was that, 10 years ago or 8 years ago or something, I took a deep breath. And as usual, I thought, this is not the way I would choose to go, but I have great respect for his musical vision and for his vision of what King Crimson could be and what we'll do. So I'm going to probably do less. It also reminded me of in the 90s when he said, Trey Gunn is a great stick player, touch guitar player. We'll have the 2 of you playing touch guitar. And I thought, oh, wow. At the least, I'm going to do half of what I was doing. And I did, but that was okay. And again, his vision is unique, and it's worth paying attention to and getting on board with. So that's what I did in this case. And I imagined, I couldn't actually imagine much of what would be going on, but my sense was I'm going to play a lot less and a lot more grounded and roots and let the drummers do this stuff. I was wrong. It didn't turn out that way. First of all, as we do with Crimson, we rehearsed a great deal. We didn't just put the band together, write arrangements, and play it. We really worked. We slogged for weeks, and the drummers slogged on their own for many more weeks, and came up with an approach, which in fact did involve click track, because the physical distance, the drummers are apart, the drummer on the left and on the right, meant not being tight at all. And we wanted, especially Gavin Harrison, who was in charge of the drum arrangements, he wanted it to be tight, and I was very happy to have it be tight. And so it was, and it was very worked out in that the bass drum action was only coming from one drummer at a time. So it was easy to sync to. It wasn't the clattering that I imagined, and I didn't need to determine, okay, here's something simple from the bass. And in fact, I ended up playing, it was different on each piece, but I ended up playing busier than I had before that, because I thinned my sound out a little bit gradually over the first months, and I found a kind of slot for me, sonic slot for myself, which enabled me to play busier, and it sounded right, and let the drums be the low foundation of the thing. In general, there was a few exceptions. And while I'm on the subject of the Crimson incarnation, that incarnation of Crimson, we started doing a lot of old material, of let's say the classic Crimson material, and that presented me a different challenge playing with 3 drummers, challenge of playing King Crimson music at all, and finding a place for yourself. But then in addition, there was this classic material that I hadn't played on, and interesting adventure that was and has been actually ever since, kind of an ongoing adventure to try to stay true to what's really special and iconic about these great bass parts, but also to be myself, either sonically or note-wise, or completely leave it in sections. And it's not a thing that I thought about and said, okay, that works. I'm going to do it. It was really right until the last shows we did last December, I was still working on what's the best approach for me. An adventure, a journey, not really an arrival, but a journey of trying to find being myself, but in the context of playing iconic bass parts that were written by somebody else.
Now, the same question really about producers. We just talked about working with all these different drummers. You're obviously an incredibly skilled session player who has really found some
yeah, more of that. Yeah.
Well, I started this interview by saying I was a huge fan. I mean, Three of a Perfect Pair is one of my favorite albums ever. I think one of the things that I've always loved about you and Crimson is there's that prog aspect that we all love, but there's always the song there. Even when it's absolutely insane, there's always a song there. I never feel like I'm listening to music just for the sake of showing everybody's techniques, or it never feels like 5 guys or 4 guys or 3 guys went into rooms and wrote riffs and then put them together, which is unfortunately how a lot of prog sounds to me. A lot of the time, especially the modern stuff, it just sounds like a lot of riffs stuck together. What I hear is there's always a song there. There's always something that brings me back to want to listen to it again. And anyway, getting back to the question, with producers, I mean, it sounds like Bob Ezrin was a massive influence on you, but you did get to work with, of course, Phil Ramone, who I only got to work with once, but he was unbelievably musical and was inspiring. Obviously, Rhett Davis, Steve Lillywhite, Daniel Lanois. I mean, that's probably a whole episode on its own. What So was like working on. Actually, we could maybe focus on that for a second. I mean, each one of those producers brings a different skill set and a different way of thinking. Are there any challenges to that, or is it just new and exciting and all of the above?
Interesting. I have worked with a lot of producers, a lot of great producers, not just the ones you mentioned.
Visconti.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jack, of course, Jack Douglas,
yes.
Dave Buttrell. I mean, it's...
I think the sessions are vastly different, each of them. And it depends, it varies a lot because of who the artist is, as much as, or more than because of who the producer is. Each producer has his own style. For instance, Bob Ezrin would dictate a lot of the way the session would go. And mostly he had artists who were cool with that. Peter, not so much, even though it was Peter's first solo album. Peter had a lot to say about it, and they would work it out. But it wasn't just, okay, here's the song, you guys play it. And sometimes, as in other albums that I did with Peter, it was, here's the song, just play it. So the adventure for me has been and continues to be working with these hopefully very talented artists and producers, and from my little niche of it, the bass part, to get the best bass part. I don't care who came up with the idea. I could get a million stories of other people than me having the idea of that bass part and me trying to happily implement it, because that's what I'm looking for, is a great bass approach for that piece. Yeah, with Bob Ezrin, I had done sessions with Alice Cooper, a few albums for Alice Cooper and Lou Reed, where Bob was really the one dictating how it went. And then with Peter, it was quite different. And also he had music that didn't lay itself down in a simple way. Harmonically, it was different than what any of us was used to playing. We had 2 guitar players or 3 guitar players there, and they had to work out a lot. That's not the same as if you have 1 guitar player. We only had 1 drummer, and also one percussionist, which makes things more complex. So kind of, as the bass player, I kind of had the easy job because there was just one of me, and while others were working out their things, I'm talking about Peter Gabriel's first album, Peter Gabriel 1 in '76. Yeah, I could slowly figure out a part that I felt worked for me. Speaking about producers in general, what really works well in every situation, in my opinion, is when the producer picks the musicians who are right for that artist, for that album. The producer, for one reason or another, hopefully has an idea, this will work, or these guys play together as a rhythm section, which was the case with Hunter and Wagner on Peter's first album, or these guys have never played together, but it'll really happen. So ideally, when it's working right, the producer puts these musicians together and lets them. Robert Fripp is very much that way. I mentioned he started the band with this incarnation with 3 drummers, and all he said to the drummers was reinvent rock drumming. That's what he said to them. He didn't say, okay, I want you to do this, and I have this idea. He said, you 3 guys, that's it. And Tony will play along with you. He'll work it out. And he had carefully chosen the guys to implement his vision with vision of their own. So on a record session that's working well, the producer has chosen, usually it's the producer, not the artist. There's exceptions, but usually the producer, Tony Visconti, kindly had me come in. He could have played the bass very well himself. He had me come in for a few pieces with David Bowie, and nobody told me anything about what to play. They seemed not unhappy. They indicated by not being unhappy that they liked what I did, and so that was that. Sometimes it goes like that quite easily, like musically rolling off a log. It's just some songs roll easy like a breeze, sifting through a summer day. I'm misquoting Paul Simon songs. Paul Simon with Phil Ramone. We could go all day of me telling stories, the ones that I remember from these sessions. Did a number of Paul Simon albums, Phil Ramone producing. Phil had got the rhythm section, Steve Gadd, Eric Gale, Richard T., fantastic rhythm section. And I was honored to be among them. And then Paul would begin the process of Paul finding the groove and the feeling that worked for Paul. Phil would just be there getting the sounds right. He didn't interfere with Paul's process because Paul had a very particular and complex process, and it was great. But Paul wasn't happy until it all aligned in his head, and then when he was happy, boom, that was it. On to the next piece. We had it. I think that's an example. Maybe that's what put that song in my mind. An example of how each kind of session is very different. And in Paul's case, the song could take a day or 2 days, or we could come back a week later. In Peter Gabriel's case, we would be a month in the studio, and then maybe come back a year later and do another month in the studio, trying to find the approach to the pieces and which pieces to do, because Peter would write a lot of pieces. All different processes, and all with good producers. Within Lanois, he wanted to introduce some ideas, musical ideas of his own to Peter's music, and he did, and it worked really well. And didn't work quickly, but it worked well musically, and allowed things to grow in ways that they wouldn't have. And that came partly from Dan being an experienced producer, but partly because he's a player too. He didn't play guitar in every session, on every track, but he could give us ideas with his guitar. Folks, choose the right players, but you knew that. and let me mention the other side of that. When we have the wrong players for the project, or players who aren't playing the way the artist or producer wants them to, maybe because the producer thought the guy played differently, or I don't know. I don't really know why. But I've been on plenty of sessions like that, and then it's work. It's hard. We're all working for the same thing, but it can be incredibly easy, and it can be quite difficult if the players are not playing the way the artist or producer wants them to, and maybe don't know how to. That happens.
Couldn't help but notice you've got your own home studio there.
Yeah.
How for recording? Are you doing a lot of remote stuff now? Is people sending you things and you're recording remotely?
Yeah, I'll say, yeah. I think it was way back in the 90s, late 90s or early 2000s, that I started to do a little bit of home recording on people's albums. Maybe first on ADAT, trading ADAT tapes.
I remember it well.
And I thought, this is not fun, and this is too bad, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to get a chance to play with that guy in Argentina who can't afford to bring me there or to come to New York City and rent a studio. And then I kind of paid attention in the next 5 years to roughly the percent, as the live sessions I did shrank to 50% to 30% to 10% to barely any. And I still do happily do some live sessions with other players, and I still treasure it because, the things that happen in the studio not only are musically special, but they're just special. It's just great. We have a great time. And when I go to the other side of the room, I can do some awfully good music, but how great a time am I going to have? Interacting with other musicians, it's different. So I'm not complaining about it. It's the way I do a lot of recordings and love doing them. And I love having this chance to play on albums that don't have the budget that could afford a studio. So it's been, by and large, good for me, and I jumped on the bandwagon early. The wrong expression, bandwagon. I jumped on the home studio thing early. I had to learn some techniques about not screwing up the recording, especially on the ADAT, and that's been an interesting journey. I'm not afraid of trying to learn new things, and generally, I wouldn't say I keep ahead of the curve on getting the bass sound perfectly on tape, but I'm not terrifically behind it. So I feel okay about that. I'm giving a good product to that. If there even is an engineer, to the engineer, but often it's the artist himself who sends me the recording, and I play bass on it. And by the way, I'm still learning about ways to get my sound a little better, and learning ways to interact with the producer or artist, whoever it is, to get them what they want. Actually, I kind of focused on that way back in the early 2000s. Because at first I had some misunderstanding that it wasn't working well. So I kind of learned what works for me about the questions to ask and how to go about it.
Are you using an amp as well as a DI? What give us a little idea of what you're normally providing people when they...
Yeah, I moved to this house in this studio about 5 years ago. Before that, I had the amp in my attic, mic'd the way I mic it, not the way a better producer might. And I used it sometime when appropriate, when I do heavy rock tracks, and I do them sometimes. Since I moved here, I did not bother to set up that amp because I have plug-in amps that to my non-engineer ears do the same thing without the house shaking when I kick it in. And indeed, it was hard to find the right mix because it was physically playing at the same time. So I use it in the box stuff, and I'm pretty particular about the chain going in and the DI. It's a radial. It's not the JDI, but it's another radial that has a couple of little. Typical of me, I can't remember the name. I'll hold it up to you for a while. There's a couple of little tweaks that I can add in when necessary when I hear them that make it a little more useful. But more than 9/10 of the things I used the radial JDI. I was very lucky that when Radial came out with that, they ran it by me early. So I had one, and I decided just then I don't have the ears to really keep searching, so I'm just going to use that one. And even when they gave me their other transformer, their quote better one, I preferred the JDI. So and I can use it live too. So that's the one I've used most through the years. But right now I have their newest tweak on that.
And I presume, you're shaping your tone through A, your performance, and B, you're using an active bass. So you're using the Music Man the Stingray to track most of the time. So you've got...
I don't know if you can see all these basses.
Can see some of them. Yep.
Yeah. How lucky am I that?
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. I got a big choice because they're different, in a subtle way. And if I'm I recently was called to go to England with Peter Gabriel, and how many basses can I bring? I can't bring 10 of them. I can bring one or two. So it's a pleasure. That's one of the good things about home recording. I have all of these basses set up that are just a tiny bit different than each other, and that's a pleasure.
I would imagine you get a lot of calls from people that are like, "Can you give me this sound from this record on this track?" And you're probably one of the most innovative bass players ever. Maybe the most innovative when it comes to the sonics.
There's smoke again.
When it comes to sonics, you talked about the funk fingers, which, if memory serves me right, from an interview you did a few years ago, you talked about it started with Stuart Copeland playing drumsticks while you were fingering with the left hand, and then And then was it you and your tech got together and came up with the idea of putting drumsticks taped to your fingers to replicate that sound? Is that my approximation sort of right?
Approximately.
Approximately.
Yeah, you know your stuff. It was Jerry Murata with the drummer, and yes, it involved my tech, and yeah, he did the track playing drumsticks on the bass. The track was big time. But then live trying to play that, I was struggling with the one drumstick, and it was Peter Gabriel who, walking by me at soundcheck, said, "Why don't you figure out a way to put two drumsticks on your fingers?" And that led to these things we call funk fingers. In fact, to addressing what you said before, that no producer that I can remember has ever called me or written me and said, "I want you to play like you did on that track." Almost never. But I learned. Remember, I said I went through this learning process. People would send me tracks, and they would want me to play like me. And here's what I learned: that I don't play like me. I tend to play a lot simpler than me. I'm being facetious because, of course, how can I know what's me? So I learned early on when I started doing home recordings that generally the artist who sent me that, or the producer or the engineer, wants a little more and a little more distinctive things than is my instinct to do. So simple solution. I would do my version, and then I would do a different version. And depending on, I would try to get a sense of how good the engineering is on the other end, because sometimes it was not so good, sometimes better than I could do. And I would get a sense of how much to mix them together and give them options so they can pull in the busier stuff. And frankly, they usually wanted the busier stuff. So I never stopped doing my version. and why not just do a busier version or a few different ones, all with the same sound, the same level exactly. And I'm fastidious about that because I don't know who's going to be engineering it at the other end, and they're going to have enough issues without me having different takes with where I got excited and played a little harder or something like that.
I did a video on Sledgehammer a year ago, and I'd read an interview with you and watched some footage of you talking about how you recorded the bass. And it was interesting, even after me quoting you, I still got people telling me I was wrong.
and indeed, maybe I was wrong, and I wouldn't try to reproduce what I said, because you could find me saying opposite thing. I recently worked with Kevin Killen, great engineer, and we talked about that, although we've talked about it a few times through the years, because he did a lot to the bass after I recorded it. And I seem to remember it being compressed at least three times, maybe twice on the way in, or once on the way in and then twice later. But it was an unusual combination of techniques, not to be bizarre, but just to fall into something that seemed to work for the piece.
Correct me if I'm wrong. You had the OC2, the Boss octave pedal.
Yeah.
You had the
it was in a good mood that day.
Yes.
Which it was not always in live. I've had to use different ones that always track the octave, but it was in a good mood that day. It was my friend. The pedal was my friend. It was certainly a compressor or two on my path. It's a fretless bass with a pick.
Yeah.
Just playing with pick on a fretless seemed, I just don't do that. So I thought, oh, that's neat. And then leaving the octave pedal kicked in for the whole piece. Don't usually do that. So that was enough. Definitely didn't chorus it that I know of.
I think most people with the pick attack, and probably with the compressor pedal and then the way Kevin was compressing it as well, exaggerates the attack so much that I think that's where people think it's the funk fingers. That's okay. Where everybody's always saying, no, it's definitely the funk fingers. You can hear it. And I think it's that pick and, the attack time on the compressor, making it go, bah, bah, bah,
yeah.
Getting it.
Yeah. There were no funk fingers then, for sure. And it was a sound that worked. An interesting thing, you, on the engineering side or producing side, you don't think about that. But as a musician who comes in and does a track or an album's worth of tracks, it's an interesting thing that you go home. I'll work a month on Peter Gabriel tracks and been doing that recently, and then go home, and a year later or 2 years later or 6 months later, it comes out and I listen to it, and it could be that I'm not on it, that there's no bass. It could be that there's another bass player on it, or in the case of Peter, one album of his, two or three bass players, and I'm still on it, but there's other basses on it. It could be that there's no bass on it. It could be that I'm on it, but I can't quite hear myself. As Peter Gabriel 1, that first album, half of the album, I know what I played, I can't hardly hear it. Or it can be, in the case of Sledgehammer, that I'm the loudest instrument on the thing. I'm like, oh my God, I hope I don't make a mistake, because they got me up at an insane level. So that's kind of fun. Yeah, I'd kind of like to have a say in it, but that's not appropriate, and it's not. Yeah, it's just not appropriate. You don't want all the musicians at all of the mixing sessions. So it's fine that they do it, but it's an interesting part of my life that I do an album and then later I hear it, and it could be just the balance that I heard it, or anything in either direction compared to that.
Obviously, making records in the 70s and probably even the 80s, sort of pre-digital at least, records didn't have the low end that we're used to now. Now we're used to just so much low end, and particularly, obviously, as hip hop has become, such a dominant musical force. Does that mean that now you're more often not playing 5 strings because you're being asked to go much lower than you used to?
Well, lower to me is a different thing than a lot of bottom end, but yeah, I usually play the 5 string, and I love my Music Man basses equally, and they're all special. The more modern ones, the more recent ones have more low end, and I don't necessarily use all that low end. I probably never use all of it, but I don't just want more low end on everything. It's not that. I try to find the appropriate sound. I don't listen to as much contemporary music as I ought to, but I hear some, and I get what you're saying about there's more low end going around. But also, the kind of music I'm playing determines a lot of it. If somebody's sending me a bunch of ballads with a guitar, yeah, they'll accept and want a little more low end than they used to want on that kind of music, but within reason. And yeah, so I'm tailoring it to what I hear is appropriate for that music. And then on the other end, either the artist or the engineer or the producer is retailoring it and maybe adding low end. Aside from the basses, I have Universal Audio plugins, and I use some EQ that I didn't used to use, but some engineers used to use the very thing, the real one, the analog one, and I find myself adding that maybe half the time, whereas 5 years ago I didn't add it hardly ever.
Are you using? You were talking about plug-in amp sims. Are you using Universal Audio's Ampeg amp, for instance? Is there a particular amp you love?
I did for a short while, but then Ampeg came out with their own.
Oh, okay.
It's very versatile and has so many settings that I had a friend who's an engineer come over to get my own sound on my own amp to sound like my own amp. Yeah, pretty complicated because I knew the settings I used to use on the SVT, but I didn't have a mic. I wasn't the one who was miking it and choosing the kind of mic and the positioning of the mic. And these, yeah, as you know, these plugins have all that. So I got a few sounds, a different one for the stick, the Chapman stick. I got a few sounds that are my basic ones, and then I'll tweak it a little bit for the piece, depending on the piece.
How did you discover the Chapman stick and the NS upright? What was the
Chapman stick was I think it was in 76, 75 or 76. I used to practice noodle. Let's call it noodling on sessions. I don't do that. I really can't stand to noodle on sessions. I don't particularly want to hear other people do it for 5 hours, but I used to do that. And what I used to do was hammer on. I saw a drummer doing it, Donald McDonald, way back in maybe 1970, and I was fooling around with that. And because of that, when Emmett Chapman came out with this new instrument that's based on hammer, touch guitar or hammer on, a lot of guys I worked with said, "Hey, have you heard there's an instrument that's the way you've been playing the bass, obnoxiously practicing, never recording with it?" No, there's one. John Lennon heard me doing it. I was still doing it in 1980 because he heard me messing around. He said, "Oh, let's start the piece cleanup time. I think let's start with you doing that." I said, "Sure." After all these years, it's about time that someone wanted to add on their record. Anyway, a bunch of people told me there's an instrument that's designed to be played that way. The next time I was in California, I went to I think Emmett was out of town, but I managed to get one. I took it to Peter Gabriel's session in '76, but didn't end up playing it on that. And the first record was Gap Mangione, a wonderful jazz pianist that I played with. And that's the first one where I actually played the stick on a few pieces. And I took my time learning it. It has a lot of strings. The first one had 5 bass strings, 5 guitar strings. I didn't even plug in the 5 guitar strings. It's a stereo output. So I spent years trying to get myself together on those 5 bass strings. Why? Because it's different than the bass. They're in fifths and they're strung backwards. And more than that, when you're playing touch style, the hard part technically is to keep the instrument quiet when you're not playing, because it's very hot, because the loudest note you can play is just like that. So it's very hot. And as you can imagine, even when you're picking your finger up, if it sticks to the string a little, then you get the open string. So it was a few years before I was comfortable. I used it live quite a bit, but a few years before I was comfortable recording with it a lot. And I certainly, since then, I've recorded a great deal of it. And then with Peter Gabriel, I thought, what's playing live, touring with him? I thought, what's this really simple piece that I can bring out the stick on? And it was Moribund, the Burgermeister. It was a Peter Gabriel piece that, not on the album, but live, I played it on the stick for years to help my own technique. And it was appropriate. The sound of the stick, very percussive, as you can imagine, because you're hammering on only. And to me, very clean and clear down low. And that enables me to play faster and, faster stuff down low that just wouldn't speak on the bass. It just, that, something like that. It just wouldn't work with my bass sound. Maybe a little bit with the funk fingers, but still, it's just more power and low end coming off the bass. The stick, Chapman stick, has some kind of low end, and it suits itself to be compressed a great deal, which I do. But it has this clarity, and then the power is a different kind of power that ends up coming through. And what it's wonderful for is big jumps, because it's tuned in fifths, so you can do low note and only one finger per note, so you can do jumps from low to high very easily. And around that time, I was finding myself in King Crimson in a progressive rock context where the usual old approach, Bill Bruford's the drummer, Adrian Belews playing stuff on the guitar that I never heard before. Robert Fripp is coming up with these compositions. So me being the Motown player that I kind of grew up to be, not appropriate in that. So hey, here's this instrument with the 5 strings strung backwards, and my fingers don't find the same patterns they used to. That's a good thing. And I found myself teaming up with Bill Bruford in his skittery tom ideas, maybe in a different time signature than the 2 guitar players. In fact, probably in a different time signature. And I found that was appropriate for that band because of what the other guys were doing. So you could look at it and say that those other 3 musicians taught me how to, not exactly what to do, but how to approach the music in the way that they were. And I did my best to join in.
That makes some sense. To me, I understand now, because I suppose you've got that percussive element with 2 hands performing in the same way.
The essential part, as pertains to King Crimson, is that it's different, that it's another tool that gives me a whole different approach. And Peter Gabriel, who's always looking for alternatives, and just the sideways thinking is his norm. So he saw the stick and said, "What if you played with thimbles? What if you put thimbles on your?" Yeah, I have still not tried that idea. I was like, "Well, Peter, that's a wild idea, but just the stick as it is already a wild idea. Let me just hold that for someday." And that was back in the '70s that he said that to me.
Well, while we were on that tact, we did talk about Sledgehammer. Then, of course, the other one that you've talked about a lot is Don't Give Up, where you talked about, as Americans would say, diapers, we say nappies. And you had them, you've said in an interview in the past that you had them in your case because you were, was this your first child? So you were a new father?
Only. Yes.
A first and only. So yeah, I've been there myself. So lots of sleepless nights, and I can imagine you've got the diapers in the case. You basically have to be ready for any eventuality. And one of those eventualities, of course, was dampening the bass for Don't Give Up.
Yes, for the second part of it. It goes into a different feel. And as you've heard me say, yes, my daughter Maggie was little. Actually, she was in a kind of papoose thing for some of the tracks with the bass on the far side of her.
Oh,
I don't remember that piece, whether she was there, but in my ignorance, going to England, I thought, well, they might not have diapers. Well, they don't. They have nappies, but of course,
yeah.
I could have got them there, but I had just stuffed them in the basin. And it's a common thing for me anyway in the studio to look for some dampening material. The Music Man basses in those days came with dampers, wonderful dampers under each string, which you could adjust, but it's a different sound completely if you dampen a wider segment of the string. And so usually there's foam rubber sitting around in studios. In that case, there wasn't, and my eyes alit on the nappies, and Peter called it the Super Wonder Nappy sound. It worked out very well for us. Live, I could not find the time to suddenly jam a diaper under the bass strings, so I did a compromise for the live version, as we often do.
Okay, so are you allowed to talk about the fact that there could be, or should be, or might be a new Peter Gabriel record coming later this year? Because Manu Katché was saying that there was one.
He did say that, didn't he? I heard a lot about that day that he said it in an interview. I thought, whoa, that's going to be interesting. Yes, we spent last September doing tracks, and I'm not going to be too good a predictor of the future, but I'll tell you what I know. Last September we did wonderful tracks. Peter had about 16 new pieces at an advanced stage, because sometimes Peter has had us come in historically when it was the beginning of an idea. No, they were pretty done, and so at the end of September I left thinking this could come out 6 months from now, or this could come out 10 years from now, or we could 5 years from now come in to redo it the way it has happened historically a few times. And then in May, I started being called from Peter Gabriel's management about coming in again to Real World Studios to tweak a few pieces that were almost there but need to be. And so we went back, the same band, David Rhodes on guitar, Manu Katché, and me, the old time band. We just are so happy being together musically and personally that it was great. And what I can say about these pieces, I think they're great. I think Peter's voice is better than ever. It was just like it was a joy to hear his vocals, which had already been done on the tracks. So that I know. Will there be will it come out this year? Will it come out next year? I hope so. Will there be a tour? I hope so. I have carved out some time, hoping that there'll be a tour. It's a funny thing not a funny thing, but being in Peter's band for so many years. I'm sort of a member of the band, but I'm sort of a fan also. So the fan in me has, for a long time, hoped that he would do another album and tour, even if I'm not in it. I would be disappointed if I'm not in it, but the fan wants to hear this new music, wants to see what production ideas Peter Gabriel comes up with. So I'm happy as could be that if something happens, I'm going to, health willing, I'm going to be there and be part of it.
I completely relate. I feel like he's one of the very few complete artists left. Somebody that gets the whole thing.
I think he's great. I wouldn't put it that way because I don't have my finger on the pulse of what's being done. I hear a lot of great music around, and I hear, by the way, a lot of great young bass players. It's fantastic. The lockdown, the 2-year lockdown, opened me up to the things that are going on YouTube that I didn't really know about. And that was really a learning experience for me, what youngsters technically doing things on bass that I never even dreamed of doing, let alone be able to do. So it's been an interesting time. And I suppose for artists, it's sort of the same. The little that I hear of what's being done, I hear amazing things that inspire me, kind of turn me on and excite me. And I imagine there's a lot more being done. However, Peter Gabriel is a fantastic artist who has imbued his music with meaning and a deeper kind of meaning than a lot of artists have. And also he's done an extraordinary variety of music through his career. He doesn't It isn't the same at all. Almost not each album, but each decade or so, it's a completely new idea. And so I've learned a lot musically just from being around the guy.
Obviously, we've touched on Robert Fripp multiple times, talking about Crimson, but can you tell us a little bit, going back to Exposure, his solo record in 1979? I mean, that's one of my favorite records after his sort of hiatus and then coming back, obviously, and playing with Bowie and everything. He must have been completely, obviously, invigorated, and it really shows. That album's such a beautiful record. Do you have any memories of it?
Not too much. I love the album, and I got to say that Stickman, the band that I tour with the most, it's a trio, and we do the piece "Breathless" from that album.
Beautiful.
And it's great. It's to Crimson fans who never heard it, it's like, that's not King Crimson. It sounds like King Crimson, but also it's a really special piece, very, very typical of Robert's writing, really special. And it's a great feeling to know that we're probably one of the only bands that's ever done it live, and we do it at every show for sure. So I'm aware of the album. I haven't gone and listened to the whole thing I don't really spend a lot of time revisiting things I've done, but when I did hear it, I was surprised at the bass sound I had and my bass approach, which is different than the way I do it on in Stickman now, but that's okay. And interesting choices of notes. And it's clear to me that I was influenced by Robert a lot. I had recorded Peter Gabriel's first album with him and then toured with Peter Gabriel. And then he asked me to be part of that rhythm section with narrator Michael Walden, I believe it was, and unusual choices for Robert of the rhythm section to be on the album. It worked well. Again, when it's working well, you just go in. Frankly, Robert is always records quickly because he's got the people he wants who are playing the way he wants them to play. So it's kind of typical of him, but not in case of every album, but we went in and we did it pretty smoothly and quickly, and that's about all I remember about it.
So over the years, you've released many solo albums and, of course, had many bands. I think we talked about, you mentioned the Liquid Tension Experiment and Stickmen. What do you feel are the most important achievements you've done with these bands? Do you feel like doing the solo stuff, like you just touched on a second ago, allows you to go back to a track from Exposure and do something, as you said, that was never played in a King Crimson or a Robert Fripp solo situation? So now you're able to do that. Is it a different outlet for you? Is it something that you're able to fulfill that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do?
Good question. I was late coming to the party of doing my own stuff. I was very happy, maybe in the mid-90s, until the mid-90s, I'm very happy just playing with whomever. And somehow I got the idea of doing a solo album called World Diary. I really took it slow. I took an ADAT machine on the road, and I did duets with the world musicians that I wanted, just all duets with a few world musicians I would run into while on the road. And I liked that. Musically, I was interacting with people. So that wasn't really a solo album. It was a series of duets. And then the next album, I formed my own record label called Papa Bear Records, because I couldn't imagine going to a label and asking them to release this weird stuff. And then found a trio who recorded in a local cave. And so that was my second album. And then the third one, Bruford Levin, Upper Extremities, I had 4 players. So I went from 2 players, 3 players, 4 players. And then I thought about, years after that, I thought about what am I going to do for solo albums. And I've done a few for sure. But I've done more than that. I've done a lot of collaborations. When you said bands, in my mind, I distinguish between bands and projects. And I'm in some bands, and I've been in one project that became a band. Generally, the players like me who get a chance to play with a couple of guys that but you don't usually play with in what I would call a project. You jump at it. Wow, that's going to be great. We'll write the music in a week or make it up in the studio, and we'll take it on the road if we can. Okay, so I've done a lot of those. Bruford Levin, Upper Extremities, Levin Torn White, Liquid Tension Experiment. Great stuff. It comes up quick and it's great fun, and you learn from it. The the inherent difficulty is all the guys are also in a real band, or that's the wrong word, a band that calls on their schedule and that plans a year ahead of time and gets a tour. So how do you get those 3 or 4 guys to do a tour when they're all in other things? What happens is the most you can do is a week or 2 tour, and it sometimes takes years to do that. So that's why I call those projects and why I distinguish them from bands. And I did a solo album called Stick Man, where I featured the Chapman Stick, played a little bass on it, but mostly the Chapman Stick. And I really liked the music. I had used Pat Mastelotto, my buddy from King Crimson, playing drums. And I thought, well, with a trio, with another stick player, we could actually play all this music live. And I don't remember if it was 15 or 20 years ago, but that really worked well. And so we have continued to tour, and it's the band I tour the most with now, partly because it's so mobile. Like Robert Fripp used to talk about a small, intelligent, mobile unit. Well, we are a trio, and with each of us able to really play 2 instruments on one fretboard, we can make a lot of noise. So that's my example of a project that became a band. And other bands like Liquid Tension Experiment, perfect example. We put out Liquid Tension Experiment. We put out a new album last year, and it was really good, and we would like to tour with it. But how can we when Dream Theater is reawakening from 2 years of sleep, and King Crimson and Peter Gabriel and all that? So we'll hope that we can tour someday, but not an active band in that it's going to be doing a lot of touring. And the experience of doing that for me has been maybe more precious than doing the solo album. I know I'm back in the studio there. I've got 8 or 10 tracks from my someday to be completed solo album. That's going to be really cool if I ever finish it, but I'm taking my time. I'm going Peter Gabriel speed because I have all these projects and other tours that are more important to me. And yeah, so my solo career is, I feel good about it. I think you asked what I felt best about, and I also have released some books that I feel very good about that take sometimes more time, more hours than making an album, and can be just as rewarding. And you like to share your ideas, whether they be stories or poems or photo books. I've released 3 photo books, and I used the whole of, what was it, 2020, that lockdown year, to finally, I've been taking photos on the road since the earth was cooling, and not the most organized guy about the negatives and the slides and the digital stuff. So I took that year and spent, well, not the year, but from June to December, finding the best of what I considered road photos that would be good enough to put out in a large book, a kind of coffee table sized book. And I felt very good about finishing that, as good as I've felt about doing any album. That's called Images from a Life on the Road, by the way. A lot of satisfaction from doing solo albums and projects, collaborative projects, and from doing my books. But also, I'm a bass player, and if I get to play on an album, and it could be not a prog album, it could be a very simple singer-songwriter album, and I'm playing simple parts on the upright with a nice big fat sound, I'm as happy doing that as I am just about anything else.
One of the names that jumped out at me is, I'm a huge Joan Armatrading fan, and I know Americans don't know Joan Armatrading, and it sort of led me to that question because you have worked with so many British artists. To many people, I jokingly said that, some people probably think you are British because you're moving between all of these different artists. Joan is, like I said, one of those artists. I remember hearing Love and Affection as a kid and just thinking, what is this? And then also wondering who played that beautiful acoustic guitar, and then finding out that she was the acoustic guitar player and a phenomenal musician as well. Did you have any recollection of how you got to work with Joan?
I don't know how it happened, and it's one of my faults. I have many, but I tend to fall into musical situations, and I don't even ask why they called me or who called me. So often I just don't know. I just show up and play the bass, and I ought to know. Maybe it was Steve Lillywhite who brought me in for it. The first one, I'm not sure, but Joan is one of those artists mean, she's different than anybody else, but she plays the guitar really well. She sings a great song, and it's got the groove in the guitar part. So it's the easiest and most wondrous thing to play bass on with somebody like that. John Lennon, when he played the songs for us for the band, here I wrote this. My thought, I didn't have much of a thought, but certainly it could have been any of 300 bass players, maybe 1,000 bass players on the planet Earth who would have done a fine and dandy bass part for that piece because it was all there for us. Felt like I'm lucky to be the one there with John. I'll give it what I can. I'll just loosen myself, and I don't know about other players. I think they're probably like me. I don't really think when I'm playing music or I'm listening to a song. I kind of there's some mental process, but it's not here. It's not an idea. It's maybe a sound comes to me, or it's a little bit like maybe if I were singing without my voice to myself, and then I'll kind of look around and see what instrument I have to best bring that to life. And it doesn't always work the first time. Maybe that's too, let me take the dampers out or something like that. And maybe Joan would say something to me. I don't remember, but maybe she would give me some hints and help me out. So I guess my point is that it's not Zen-like, but it's definitely not an intellectual process I go through playing music. And probably that's why I love it so much and why it always seems fresh and wondrous. It's not like, this again. Oh, playing a great song again. What'll I do? I'll do what I did before.
Jack had told me that John Lennon had said to him, I trust you to hire the band. You hire the players that you want. He goes, but they have to understand the music that I love. And I remember Jack said he was in his mind, he wanted to choose the players that would understand the music that John Lennon grew up on. So I think the Motown thing that you were talking about was probably, that would have been what would have clicked with Jack. Because he said that John Lennon didn't want, the latest, hippest, coolest, whatever. He wanted people that were incredibly creative, but also understood the history of rock and roll and Motown, as you're saying. So that's one bit of insight as to the insight into the choice of the play.
Interesting. Yeah, I had never heard that. That's very interesting. And indeed, John was between takes. He was over and over again playing Buddy Holly things and old rock things, and we would join in, and then kind of John would suddenly stop us. He'd get annoyed at himself or at us. Like, let's get to work. Let's do this piece, and then we would immediately do his piece. I remember coming into the studio, and the first thing he said, I got to meet him, and he said, "They tell me you're good, just don't play too many notes." Those were his first words. It was a very New York, in your face way to say hello. And I was a New Yorker at the time, so it was fine with me. And I knew I wouldn't play too many notes. So I said, yeah, don't worry, it'll be fine. And I was really gratified later in the mixes to hear that he clearly had liked what I did. And sometimes it was doubled by other instruments and things like that. But like I said, easiest thing in the world to play those pieces. To be honest, Yoko's pieces were not easy to play. She doesn't play an instrument. The arranger had written the chords out, but that wasn't much of an indication. So that was a process that was kind of tough. And she had to help us try and find the directions for each piece. But John's were I think I'm trying to think if I had to make an effort to not play too much like Paul, or if not, I don't actually remember the process, but I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I was like, wow, I can do this. And I had an early Music Man with the built-in dampers, and I immediately set up a little dampened strings and got a sound that's okay, to be honest, not awfully different than a Hofner. and I went with it.
Yoko's songs on that record are incredibly inventive, though. It's a real yin and yang. I think when I listen to Double Fantasy, you've got those huge pop rock songs that John wrote, which are just absolutely massive. Watching the Wheels and Beautiful Boy. I mean, just Starting Over, which is very 50s rock and roll. With the slap on the vocal and just the whole feel of it. But Yoko's stuff is so angular and different, but really super, super creative. So it makes the album incredibly interesting to listen to.
I am just in the process of listening to. I haven't listened to it in all these years at all, but I'm going to come to Liverpool in August to be part of the Beatles festival, and they've reassembled that band to play those pieces. So I'm starting to listen to them and saying, do I actually need to write this out, or do I know this? And it won't be long till I remember them all.
So I suppose, I was going to ask you what you're up to now. That sounds like one of the things that you're up to. You're waiting to find out when Peter's a Record's coming out, and maybe you're going to be touring. When is there another Crimson tour coming up that we're allowed to know about?
First of all, there is no King Crimson on the horizon. We've ended the touring of this incarnation. Will there be something in the future? We don't know. Quite likely not. Robert has said a few different things about it, Robert Fripp, but mostly he says, I won't speak to it. I'll wait until King Crimson speaks to me. So I know for the next few years, the guys in the band in that incarnation are busy with other things. So I'm looking at it is in a bittersweet way, of course, after 40 plus years in the band, as we're done touring. And if the chance comes up again, that'll be great, but unlikely. So looking at what I'm doing chronologically from here on, next week I have this wonderful music camp that Adrian Ballou and Pat Mastelotto and I do every year. It's called Three of a Perfect Pair Music Camp. And we have a wonderful, faithful group of campers, of musicians who come, and we have a great time, about 190 or 100 people. So I'm looking forward to that week. I have a lot of practicing and preparation to do, because there'll be jams of pieces that I did in the past, maybe Alice Cooper, or not so much King Crimson pieces. I could look at anyway, I have to relearn these things that the other guys have been practicing, guys and women have been practicing to jam with me. And at the end, we'll do a concert of King Crimson stuff with Adrian and Pat and myself. And at the end, after the camp is over, we'll do one show here in Woodstock for the public to hear the reincarnation of this Crimson alumni. Then later in the summer, I will come to England for the Liverpool Beatles Festival. Then I will tour with Levin Brothers, a jazz band. In September, we'll tour the east coast of the U.S. That's with my brother Pete Levin and myself. And then King Crimson in October and November. We'll do 2 separate tours of the U.S. and of South America. And then I have a couple in January, February, too. I think the West Coast with Levin Brothers, and maybe Japan, maybe China they're looking at. It's not booked yet. And I'm holding from then on in the hope that Peter Gabriel will find a way to tour. When a rock musician, probably your listeners understand that, when a rock musician talks about the future, says, I'm going to do this, what a normal person would say, there's a good chance I'm going to do this, because things fall through, they change, tours grow, they shrink. Nowadays, a disease can come up that cause flights to not be possible. Like I mentioned, China in 2020, was it Stickman? Yeah, Stickman were just about to begin a tour of Japan and China, right when COVID came out. And maybe the day before we got on the plane to Japan, China was canceled. We went to Japan and got there, and Japan was canceled. We did one show in Nagoya, and then we had to struggle to find a way back because our flights were through China, and that was not the time to go. So, yeah, I'm a musician talking about these tours that are going to happen, by which I mean they're booked, and there's a good chance they'll happen.
Well, Tony, thank you ever so much. Thank you for giving us so much of your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Warren. I appreciate your wonderful questions that spur my brain to go back to these situations, and I hope my answers were useful to your listeners, and I appreciate you having me on.